Hi, I'm Amy Gillett, Vice President of Education at the William Davidson Institute at the University of Michigan, and I'm delighted to be here today with Elmira Bayrasli. Elmira is the author of a book, From the Other Side of the World, which interviews entrepreneurs in some unlikely places. She's also a professor at Bard College, and she's the co-founder of Foreign Policy Interrupted. Elmira, so good to have you with us today.
It's good to be here, Amy.
My first question is, you say in your book, From the Other Side of the World, that Steve Jobs' spirit has gone global. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Sure. I think the Silicon Valley phenomenon has certainly captured the imagination of people here in the United States. And you're constantly hearing about somebody launching their own new startup, a new technology, a new mobile app. And we've generally associated that type of entrepreneurship with America. You know, whether it's bootstrapping and building up something, it's become a very American phenomenon. But as the daughter of immigrants from a formerly a developing country, what I saw as growing up and going back to the country where my parents are from, which is Turkey, is that entrepreneurial spirit existed there too. And I was always curious, why is it that America is associated with entrepreneurship, but Turkey is not? Because there's so many people there, hustling, selling what they could on the streets, try to make ends meet. And I thought, here these people are very inventive. What I came to realize during the course of researching and writing my book is that a couple of things have changed the dynamics around the world. One is globalization, and the second is technology. And the combination of those two have enabled entrepreneurs, whether in Asia, Africa, Latin America, or the Middle East, to actually take that spirit of Steve Jobs, which has always existed in those places, and to actually overcome the obstacles that have previously prevented them from starting innovative, high-scale, globally competitive companies.
Fantastic. Now, you've talked about overcoming obstacles. Are obstacles still in some of these developing countries, and which ones are some key obstacles that you've observed on your travels and in your interviews with entrepreneurs?
Sure. I mean, I think those obstacles are not unique to any one country. I think that, number one, I think entrepreneurs the one thing that they'll always talk about is, all of the challenges that they have to face and all the obstacles they have to overcome. And I think regardless of whether you're in Silicon Valley, Ann Arbor, or in New York City, or in Mumbai, or in Beijing, you're faced with the same challenges. Where do I find skilled talent? How do I raise investment capital? How do I get my product to market? But what I saw particularly in places like Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East is they have a lot more bigger challenges. And those challenges include poor infrastructure, the simple fact that you can't get from point A to point B. And that's a real problem, especially if you're trying to sell products, right? How are you going to get the simple product, from one place to another? A second big challenge is corruption. In places where they have weak rule of law, which is, I think, a challenge unto itself, corruption really does erode the incentive to actually go out and try to build a business, especially if you don't have connections and you don't have a lot of capital to begin with. The fact that you have to bribe the bureaucrat or, bribe somebody in order to get something that you need, that actually can kill an entrepreneur's spirit. But then you also have things like a culture where you may have skilled engineers who are just as good as the engineers that are coming out of Silicon Valley, but they're just not in a culture that is used to taking initiative and actually going out there and innovating and pushing back on the founder, pushing back on someone's ideas and saying, no, I don't think that is going to work. So I think a lot of these things are slowly starting to actually change around the world, and that's why you're starting to see success stories come out of places like Brazil, Mexico, Egypt, China, India, and Turkey.
Fantastic. So what can U.S. organizations do to spur entrepreneurship in developing economies?
That's a great question. I think that there are at a number of different levels. I think certainly at a government level, I think that, what the State Department has been focused in the past couple of years, specifically supporting a global entrepreneurship summit every year, and trying to go out there and tell entrepreneur stories. I think that is a great thing that they can do. The government should use its platform to convene. The government has the reach and it has the power to do that. And so to actually propel entrepreneurs forward by convening them, but then also talking to their interlocutors, whether it's in different capitals or in multilateral organizations, the importance of startups and innovations and how that is important to progress in general. So I think on a government level. I think on an academic level, I think institutions like the University of Michigan and WDI are doing a great job connecting with other academic institutions around the world. I think making those connections are enormously important because it is the exchange of ideas that ultimately make progress. Startup ideas and innovations don't happen in a vacuum. I mean, the whole myth of, somebody in a garage starting something simply isn't true. It happens when people are coming together. So I think academic institutions being able to have the human exchange, the educational and the knowledge exchange is incredibly important. And I think the third factor is the private sector. I think you have, corporations who are interested in actually going into new markets, but also investors. Investors understanding, what is the market in China instead of kind of being attracted to the buzz and the headlines of how China is growing. Really taking the time to spend and understand what is Chinese innovation, how are they building their startups, which is significantly different from what we see in Silicon Valley. I mean, entrepreneurship is not cookie cutter. It's not one size fits all. And I think it's very important for the private sector to understand that something that worked in Silicon Valley might not necessarily work in India or in Nigeria.
Okay, great. How can entrepreneurship affect foreign policy? And why do you think such a small percentage of U.S. development money goes towards supporting entrepreneurship around the world?
I'll try to dissect those two questions. I'll take the second part first. So I think development money and entrepreneurship, I think this is a little bit controversial. And I know that USAID has a lot of different programs focused in on entrepreneurship. I know that they put together contests and competitions, and I think that that is very worthwhile. But I think the one thing that, if we're going to talk about development money, I think the one thing that I would love to see more of is initiatives by OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, to actually match grant funds to other funds in countries. So for example, OPIC had guaranteed a fund in the Middle East so that if Middle Eastern funds were investing in entrepreneurs, whether in Jordan, Lebanon, or in Egypt, OPIC was going to guarantee that fund. And I think that that is actually going to do more to develop those countries than actual aid money or projects that are run by USAID. So the first part of your question about how does entrepreneurship affect foreign policy? Enormously. So what you start to see is, as entrepreneurs around the world, and this is certainly something that I've seen, whether it's in Turkey, Nigeria, India, or China, is that slowly as entrepreneurs start scaling up their businesses, what happens is that they're creating more jobs. Mm-hmm. That is creating a cycle of bringing more people into the middle class. People have stable jobs, they have more disposable income. When people are moving into the middle class, the phenomenon, a number of things happen. They have more demands on the kind of products they have, so the quality of products go up, but they also have more demands on their government. Are the buses running on time? Is the trash getting picked up? What is the quality of the schools? And then what also happens is they become more confident about who they are in and of themselves. I remember as a child when my parents used to take me to Turkey, the only thing anybody ever wanted to do was leave. How can we come to the United States? How can we move to Europe? There are no opportunities here. Now Turks want to stay, and they're proud. And I think where it affects foreign policy is when you have proud people, you also get nationalism. And so you have the phenomenon of the rise of the strongmen. So if you take a look at all the countries I listed before, Turkey, China, and India, all of them have given rise to strongmen, but then also in the Philippines, in Hungary, in Poland. And there is this phenomenon where people who have done well are feeling like, I don't want to give that up, and I certainly don't want to kowtow to whether it's the United States or the West. We've made it, and we are economically viable. I certainly think the Chinese have taken a position where they're not going to take orders from the United States anymore.
Right, so a little bit of a double-edged sword there.
It is a double-edged sword.
Okay, you've traveled to many developing countries to speak with local entrepreneurs. What was the most unlikely place you've seen entrepreneurship take root?
Wherever I go, I see entrepreneurship. I landed in Lagos, and I was so surprised to see, people selling. They would carry, products on their heads. Newspapers and soda and peanuts and chips. But then I also saw one man selling an iron and selling just random goods. And I thought, here is an entrepreneurial culture. Here's a guy who's got whatever goods he's found, and he's out there and he's trying to sell it. I don't think I was surprised in any one particular place, but I think one of the things that prompted me to go out and write my book is that when we think about entrepreneurship here in the United States, we automatically associate it with technology. So we automatically name the entrepreneurs. We name Steve Jobs, we name Bill Gates, we talk about Sergey Brin and Larry Page at Google, we talk about Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook, all men, by the way, I would like to note. But when we talk about entrepreneurship outside, when we say, Africa, Latin America, or the Middle East, we actually imagine a woman. And we imagine her selling goods, tchotchkes or small things, crafts that she's developed in a community space with other women. And so there's a different concept when the word entrepreneurship means something different depending on the context. And I think the thing that propelled me to write this book is what I was seeing certainly in Turkey, a country that I know very well, but then also going to places like Egypt, or going to India, or going to Mexico and Brazil, is what I found is there are high-tech entrepreneurs in these countries. And certainly Mexico, I think, is an untold story, because what the Mexican entrepreneurs have figured out is rather than going and facing out to consumers and having either a retail product or service that you and I can buy, is that they're doing B2B businesses. And they're actually helping other businesses succeed. Which is why I think the Mexican story is one that is completely untold. But I think that the surprise for me is, why aren't the stories being told about the technologies and the innovations that are happening around the world?
Right. Okay, so you mentioned women, that the fact that all of these big tech startups were founded by men, and that's who we talk about. Are we just not getting the stories out about the women around the world? Or what can be done to spread the word about women and innovation?
I think number one, I think there's a couple of things. I think the media does do a bad job. I think that they're focused on the low-hanging fruit, and men tend to be the loudest people in any room, and so they're getting all of the attention. So I think that the media needs to, I think journalists and media outlets need to do a harder job in actually finding the women who are doing the technology, and certainly they are. I mean, to say that they're not is just simply wrong. I also think that in terms of women who go out there and do decide to become entrepreneurs, what I found in doing my research is that they tend to become entrepreneurs in traditionally kind of female verticals. So, whether it's in retail, fashion, beauty, makeup lines, shoes, and the food industry, which doesn't necessarily have the same impact and scale that you have when it is actually, a phone or a technology that is going to be used by everyone, male or female, right? So the women are actually going into verticals where the impact isn't going to be, the multiplication isn't going to be as impactful as the traditional industries.
Okay, great. What role does education play, or should it play, in a thriving entrepreneurial ecosystem?
I get this question a lot. I personally don't think that you can teach entrepreneurship. And that's not to say that education doesn't have a role. I think education is enormously important in entrepreneurship, but I don't think in the way that a lot of academic institutions have set it out. I don't understand why entrepreneurship is taught in the business schools. Yes, I understand that there's accounting and that there are management things that are involved in running a business, and certainly you need people who are capable of doing that if you are setting up an enterprise. Entrepreneurship is about solving problems. And if you take a look at the most successful entrepreneurs, a lot of them didn't go through business school. A lot of them also didn't finish college. And when you take a look at the Steve Jobs stories, the one class that he said that made a huge difference in his life was a calligraphy class. And I think what sets Apple apart isn't anything that Steve Jobs learned in an institution. It's things that interest him and opened up his perspective and horizons. And that's where education comes in. I actually think that entrepreneurship should be taught in liberal arts programs, because it is about solving problems. It's about understanding people and responding to needs on the ground. Calligraphy simply captivated Steve Jobs, and we are then, design became a huge element of what Apple is. He was very fascinated with Japan and how, Japanese packaging. And again, this is the appeal of Apple. It's not necessarily the technology, although the technology, is absolutely, unparalleled. It is very good technology. But I think, when you're talking about, can you learn entrepreneurship? I don't think you can learn it in an entrepreneurship class.
Okay. What about the case where you have a startup in an emerging market and they're kind of stuck, they're not growing, and they need kind of new skills to move forward, maybe new skills on how to reorganize their workforce, or new kind of skills about marketing and discovering new markets. What do you think about that?
But I also think, again, number one, I think an entrepreneur will always be an entrepreneur. You're not going to stop that spirit. Somebody who's going to try to, again, figure out how to solve a problem. And if an entrepreneur is stuck, again, it's about unlocking human potential. How do you hire the right people? I don't think any business room class is going to teach you how to do that. I just don't see that happening. And again, if you really want to understand people, read 19th century literature, read the Russians, read French literature, read contemporary, writers today, and understand, what are people thinking and how are they perceiving things, or even just go to the movies. Mm-hmm. I think that entrepreneurs, again, it's about solving problems for us people. And I know that technology has become a huge phenomenon, but the technology is still used by people. Human behavior, what is compelling individuals to go on Facebook or to use Snapchat or to use Uber, right? It's about our needs and really understanding how humans are wired.
Excellent. What about in Turkey? I know there's a clothing company that you've mentioned before that has kind of captured the international imagination and gone global. And what do you think their secret is? Tell us a little bit about the company and how.
Sure, it's Mavi Jeans. And I think the secret for Mavi Jeans is along with the Turkish story of textiles. So I think anybody wearing, a pair of denim jeans, the likelihood that their denim jeans were sourced in Turkey is very high, because most denim companies actually source their cotton in Turkey. And this was something that the Turks were very big on, and it's one of the reasons that Turkey and China are constantly at odds over because of the textile market. And Mavi Jeans simply said, we're going to take this model of Zara and H&M and create fashionable, high-quality jeans that are affordable for the middle class. And it's been a huge phenomenon. In New York, they have huge shops in Manhattan and in Brooklyn. And I'm certainly a buyer of Mavi Jeans, and it's become a global brand name.
Fantastic. Are they using the fact that their origin is Turkey in their marketing, or is that sort of incidental to the story?
It's incidental. They're not focused on that at all. I think what they're focused in on is the consumer. And they really are very focused about what does the consumer want, what does the consumer care about, and they're very much focused, rather than their own origin story, about, well, who is buying it, and how are they feeling about the product.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Elmira. This has been wonderful. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Amy.